What we're looking at here now is discussing the issue of type 2 diabetes, or the potential for type 2 diabetes, which is generally lifestyle-based diabetes, the one that is more likely to be associated with the lifestyle problems that we generally deal with in Western society. Now, just to go back and have a lead-in on that explanation there for what the components are in glucose management. If you look at this overhead here, okay, we've got basically in green inside the chart here, we've got the glucose molecules. In blue inside the chart, we've got the insulin molecule. Now, insulin is obviously the hormone that actually helps the transport of glucose from the bloodstream up to the areas where the glucose is needed. And three big examples there are the brain, okay, the muscles, and also the organs of the body, which all need glucose as part of their environment to give themselves enough energy to do the things that they need to do. Okay, so as part of a normal functioning system, when glucose enters through your digestive system, it comes into the bloodstream. So remember, we're looking at the bloodstream here. So this is after you've actually broken it down and absorbed the food. From the carbohydrate component of the food, glucose will appear. In response to that green glucose appearing in this particular overhead here, the blue insulin will increase to actually help that glucose get out of the blood and move into the areas that we need to go to. To assist that process, on the edge of each of your blood vessels, you have insulin receptors. Okay, insulin receptors are virtually like a gateway that actually allow the glucose to be transported from here in here. If we don't have any of the blues available, okay, then those little gateways won't open, and therefore the glucose will just stay in here. And that's actually the more severe form of diabetes if that happens, where you're not making any insulin at all. It's not generally the one we see as a lifestyle diabetes. It's the real nasty one where people are rushed to hospital with super high glucose and generally lose a lot of weight and have various other complications as well. That's type 1 diabetes. In type 2, we generally find that most people who start with type 2 diabetes generally have insulin available. So this process at this level is working normally for most of us, and then progressively, as we'll see when we move on to the next slide, what we see progressively for a lot of us is that over time, these normal insulin receptors, which should be working nice and effectively, that's why they're in blue on the chart there, okay, sometimes over periods of time they can change, and they can change in their ability to work effectively. So we get what's called an altered receptor. That can be through genetics. One thing that's interesting, because Brian's alluded to the fact that the more fitter you are, the better you process fat. Well, the other thing I'd like to say is the more fitter you are, the better you process glucose as well. And generally speaking, because fitness has a role to play in helping these receptors to respond more effectively. So fitness has a role in that as well. So one part of it is in fat metabolism, one part of it is in glucose metabolism, which is great. Because if your fitness helps support improving your metabolism of both of those things, then you're going to be a healthier person. And that's what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so again, it's really important to think about that with fitness. And we're talking about diet here, but it's really important to think about that with fitness. It's not just a body shaping technique, it's also a fuel efficiency technique. Now, any of you wanting to look after yourself, fuel efficiency is an extremely important thing. If you're not fuel efficient, it becomes harder to achieve the goal. And that's part of the achievement you have here. So what we're saying here, even with glucose management, the fitter you are, generally speaking, the better these receptors work. One of the main reasons for that is that generally the leaner you are, particularly if you don't have weight around the middle of your body, generally speaking, the better these receptors work. The more overweight you become, the worse these receptors tend to work. Okay, so that's why over time, if these are working poorer and poorer, okay, we can get into this progressive form of problem, which is where we got to yesterday. We get into this progressive form where we call now insulin resistance syndrome, where we've got a number of these normal receptors which have now been affected, and therefore the body's needing to respond to that. And the way the body responds is making, generally, for most of us, more insulin. Okay, we make a heap of this, okay, to try and get that system to feed the glucose from the blood into those organs. And that can be a problem, because what we're alluding to is the fact in the inflammation process is that too much of this stuff floating around appears to aggravate inflammation. And we know that inflammation, as we said yesterday, is the chain reaction, the start of the chain reaction that leads to the progression of a lot of these disorders. So keeping your insulin, everyone talks about keeping your glucose under control. We talk about keeping your cholesterol under control. But the modern thing will be, I think we'll get an understanding of one of the better things to try and do is keep your insulin under control as well. we'll gradually learn that that is another thing that will be useful for long-term health management. My personal belief is that this is probably not so much perhaps the tip of the iceberg, but I still think it's up close to the top of the iceberg. Whereas at the moment we're saying, well, it's the big thing, it's the big focus. We know that insulin's too much insulin is a big issue. By the way, in saying that, remember enough insulin or just enough is friendly. So here's one of these things that you must have it. It's good for you in the right levels. It's only too much that causes a problem. A bit like cholesterol. Too much is the problem. Cholesterol isn't an enemy, just too much of it's an enemy. Okay, so with insulin, okay, we want to look after ourselves in a way that we're not needing as much of that to be produced. And unfortunately, the lifestyles we lead now, lack of activity, and the type of food selections we make, generally speaking, will push our insulin requirement up over time, and consequently we'll get a lot of these lifestyle diseases.